So Allan is an architect, author, editor, and curator. He also serves as director of graduate programs in architecture and professor at the University of Miami School of Architecture. His research focuses on themes of modernism, tropicality, and urbanism. Published works include Building Bacardi, Architecture, Art, and Identity, Miami Modern Metropolis, Paradise and Paradox in Mid-Century Architecture and Planning, and many other great books. And he also founded Shulman and Associates in 1996. And under his leadership, Shulman and Associates projects have been widely recognized with 86 design awards and publication internationally. And so Allan's going to speak today a little bit about the Resiliency Guidelines project that they've just recently started with the city, so we're looking forward to hearing a little teaser about it. And so let's welcome Allan. Thank you.
Daniel, thank you to everybody for the invitation. I think this is a really important theme that I'm very excited about working on. It's something I've been interested in for a long time. The project that we're working on for the city of Miami Beach right now is resiliency guidelines for historic districts. And we know a lot about our historic districts now. I think we're learning a lot about resiliency, but the connection between resiliency and historic preservation is a complex one with a lot of challenges and a lot of conflicts, a lot of potential conflicts. And so this is a very challenging project, one that could yield a lot of different results, but I'm excited about this challenge because I think it's one that Miami Beach actually has a lot of resources to deal with and to be a leader in many ways. And I think a lot of people are looking to Miami Beach for leadership in this way. I think Miami Beach is kind of a laboratory in which some of these ideas are going to be tested out. So let me just tell you a little bit about what I'm working on. I apologize, this is a very preliminary presentation. We've just started the project. We're not that deeply into it yet, and I haven't presented, for instance, we haven't presented to Debbie yet, so, or to the city planning, to the planning office. We're basically developing these guidelines as we go, but I wanted to show you some of the themes, some of what we're thinking about, and how we're thinking about it. So I think maybe a good place to start is with the centrality of water in both Miami and in Miami Beach. The city is literally surrounded by water. Water laces through the city. It's underneath the city. The city sits on a lytic rock-based foundation made through aquatic processes. So water has a very strong connection to the identity of the city, although we've spent nearly a century trying to keep it out. Of course, that's part of the foundation of Miami Beach as well. On top of that, Miami Beach is its own city. Sea level rise is a global problem, but we're really dealing with a local problem right now. Miami Beach is a city of about 90,000. It is independent, it has its own culture, it has its own history, and so one of the areas that we're beginning to work on this project is through that lens, through the lens of things that are specific to us, to the city of Miami Beach. Miami Beach can stand in for many narratives. This is one of the things I love so much about the city. It is a land product of the machine age. It's a story of man over nature in a way, when you think about how almost all of the landed area that you see in this image was produced by dredging and other mechanical processes. It is what I often call an accidental city, one carved not just from the water, but from the idea of a suburb underlies Miami Beach's own sort of historic foundation. If we had followed the planning and the initial models identified, there would have been a few grand hotels and a lot of houses here, a lot of small villas. So that process of successional urbanism, successional architectures that are constantly at work here is very interesting to me. It is a city that stands in for the power of resort and hospitality to make a viable urbanism. It is a city of Epicurean architecture and architectural modernism with few parallels. It is a residential, a walkable, and a very livable city. It is a tropicalist city, or it has tropicalist bones, tropicalist ideas. It was at one time a golden city for the elderly. It is a city of culture and cultural tourism. It is a cosmopolitan city. But one of the things that I think cannot be doubted at this point is that it's a city of historic preservation. Historic preservation plays a huge role in the history and development and identity of Miami Beach. One of the things that we're doing is just going back and reading all the designation reports, because I think it's important to know when the districts were designated, both on the National Register and locally, what was considered important. We may not take that as the ultimate word because maybe other relevancies have developed over time. For instance, it was really the architectural character of the districts that underlies its designation, but perhaps there are other historical, facts and figures that come to play an important role. One of the things that I think is interesting about preservation in Miami Beach is that it balances perhaps between two channels. One, dealing very much with the buildings, the material culture of the city, right? It's the fabric that makes architecturally and urbanistically what we know as our historic districts. The preservation of that fabric. But there's another side that has to do with the social, with activism, with identity, and with planning. So, in effect, preservation underlies a lot of the planning of the city of Miami Beach today. And if we were to look at a map of our historic districts, we now see that, most of high-density, mixed-use commercial Miami Beach is historic. There are little islands that are not. Most of what we see that is not is houses. So that's quite an impressive fact. 4 National Register districts, 12, maybe 13. 14 historic, local historic districts, many other individually designated sites are part of the fabric of everything about this city. Historic preservation played a very important role in giving us the identity that we now know as the city. But one of the questions we ask as we begin this process is, will it be the protagonist, the antagonist, or the victim in confronting the next challenge of resilience? And I'm an optimist, so I go for the protagonist, but it remains to be proven as well. So I think the octopus has already been mentioned today, but these images travel broadly and also begin to define the image of the city. And I think that what I'm guessing is that sea level rise or adaptation to sea level rise is actually going to be another layer of the city's identity, and I see it through that prism. But I also see Miami Beach as a very layered place, so I'm going to talk more about that in a moment. But I think this offers opportunities. We know that, the beach is very vulnerable to water, to both storm events, storm surge, to flooding through rain events, to to other storm impacts. So, but it's not all the same either. Districts vary, and there are subtle differences, but those subtle differences can have major effects. And so here's a map that through a LiDAR investigation that basically shows the elevations of streets. This is being redone right now to confirm in a much more detailed way. But we can see that in fact, the area at Miami Beach that was actually the big drive originally here is quite high, it's in red, and the beach slopes to the west. And the area that our investigation is going to be working on is, at least in the Flamingo Park neighborhood, is on this western flank. This is research by Laura Weinstein-Berman and Kiao that basically begins to illustrate what we can anticipate as effects of water, based both on a 2-foot sea level rise and 4-foot sea level rise scenario on various sites and buildings. There's a lot of mapping that's being done right now, and we're doing our own mapping. But just to give you a sense of what our mission is, I interpret our mission as to provide a decision-making guide for the historic preservation and planning department to refer to and making decisions about adaptation and changes to buildings in the Collins Waterfront and Flamingo Park districts. And also, we're trying to create a toolkit for individual property owners and developers to begin to create their own, to begin to make their own adaptations. These are the two districts that we're working on. The western flank of the Flamingo Park district and the western flank of the Collins Waterfront district. And one thing that we've realized straight away is that these districts are very different. Like, I think there's an idea that perhaps the project that we're working on might be like a model that can be applied in other areas of the city, or perhaps even in other cities. But these districts just alone are so different that I think they may merit different toolkit of approaches between them. But this remains to be investigated. This is our team. Our clients, of course, is the city of Miami Beach. We're the prime consultants working on historic preservation, urban planning, architecture. We're working with a great international engineering firm, ERA, who are doing coastal, civil, geotechnical engineering, hydrology, geology, a New York-based landscape architecture studio called D-Land. Youssef Hashem is a local structural engineer many of you are probably familiar with. Coastal, which is dealing with civil engineering, local coastal impacts, and Stephen Hauk, who's a building elevation expert. So you can guess that one of the things that we've been asked to look at and that we are looking at is the idea of raising buildings. The city already has quite a lot of investment and infrastructure in terms of resiliency planning. This is the city's website, which was mentioned earlier by Commissioner Semgulian. Rising above, this site contains a lot of information, a lot of references to city ordinances. The city has, in the last 10 years, taken a completely new direction in dealing with resiliency. I seem to remember that although people at University of Miami, FIU, et cetera, were interested in this theme for many years, that cities, Miami Beach being one of them, up until maybe around 10 years ago, it was a kind of a subject nobody really would discuss in public. And now things have really changed. It is almost thematic. It is the theme of the next set of issues that we will be dealing with. But I know you all know these changes that have been operating in various areas of Miami Beach, the raising of roads, infrastructure, the creation of pumping systems. These are views before and after of the district of Sunset Harbor. We've been looking at, on our tour that we did at the initiation of this project, how the raising of roads will intersect with historic districts. And this is 11th Street, which is probably the first place that we can see those impacts directly. And here are views that we took on the right-hand side ourselves on that tour, and on the left-hand side, the Google Earth views from before. So you can begin to see perhaps a template of what things are starting to, how these street racing effects are working with historic properties. So sometimes very subtle, sometimes a little bit more noticeable. So this is where the road has been raised about 2 feet, for instance, covering these vents, and sort of subtly but noticeably changing the relationship of the building to the ground. I think it's interesting that not only is Miami Beach dealing with these resiliency issues, and this is a quote from Susie Torriente, together we are writing the textbook for addressing sea level rise, reducing our risks, and creating a vibrant and resilient city of tomorrow. So again, this is being taken on as more than just we need to think about this. This is being taken on as a sort of mission of the city. When we talk about, partners, our clients, Miami Beach, the State Department of Historic Resources and the SHPO, the State Historic Preservation Office, National Park Service will have to become partners in this process because these will have impacts on National Register districts. We see also local organizations like NPPL and the Heritage Trust as important partners. And when we zoom out, well, it becomes a little bewildering because there are so many, agencies, stakeholders, groups that are part of this and more. This is like an abbreviated list. I could put down 5 or 6 universities just off the top of my head who have done studies in this area. So there's an amazing amount of interest, activity in the area of resilience and historic preservation and Miami Beach in particular. So one of the things we're starting to do is weed through all that and find what is relevant to our own study. Another thing that we're doing is looking at best practices. So many other cities have been dealing with this issue as well, and it's quite interesting to kind of compare ourselves and see where the issues overlap. On the left is Boston, and on the right, this is actually something put out by the Florida Division of Emergency Management. On the left, Annapolis, Maryland. So this is quite a large theme. There are many approaches. One of the interesting things we're finding is that some of the approaches, the best practices go back. When I think of some of the most dramatic responses to the effects of water, to resiliency, I think of Galveston, Texas, where the city was parts of the city were elevated and a new seawall built around the city, or Chicago, which we don't think of a city as being particularly vulnerable to sea level effect or sea level rise or water, but was at one time built on a very low land level, and where whole blocks were raised. This is an image of the raising of a block. Whole blocks were raised. So just to bring it back to the local for a moment, my own background, my own research has been in exploring the urbanism, the architecture, the relationship between urbanism, architecture, and historic preservation in the beach. And I've been fascinated by the particular characteristics that we have in this city that I think are unique. When I first saw, there's millions of photos of Miami Beach, but I love this photo because it was captured in about 1965. It captures something of the multiplicity of the city, of the compression of the buildings against each other while still maintaining, in effect, individual freestanding buildings. The grain, if you really read the grain through the city that is still legible today. As I said earlier, I think this is, maybe incidental isn't the right word, but there is there's an unintended result in Miami Beach that comes out of a process that has evaded control. Like, Miami Beach grew according to mechanisms that had to do with the economy, with land use practices, many other factors. But there is a kind of general consistency to the buildings. And the buildings, because they're all built on lots actually initially platted for houses, for single-family houses, there's a lot of innovation in the way that the buildings adapt. I would almost say that Miami Beach is already an incredibly well-adapted, resilient city, and the historic preservation movement illustrates that super well. If we just jump really quickly through the layers, and I'm not going to focus on a historical approach, but there are lessons and issues that I think resonate to today that will be interesting for us. For instance, the fact that most of the land of the city is artificial and is fabricated, was dredged up from the bay. The seawalls, the edges of the land are not original edges of the land either. They're all imaginary. They were created based on mapping and certain issues having to do with Coast Guard lines and navigable channels. And so this artificial land layer, which is now at risk, when we see it, from certain angles and in certain views, we see really how artificial it was, and just how close to the water it is, right? It's just lying right above the water line. Miami Beach has always had this vision of itself as being one thing, that has been carved out of different reality. This is another one of my favorite images because it shows the sort of original condition around Lincoln Road. On the bottom left is the sort of after photo, the Flamingo Hotel, the tea dance party under the palm trees that were also really not, indigenous. And then all the machines that made it possible in the middle. It's a quite extraordinary image. That accidental urbanism, the city was planned without any parks, without any monuments, without any civil infrastructure. There was no place for a city hall identified. There was no school identified. It was simply platted land. So the processes over time that have yielded such a rich urban fabric are really interesting. And I think that is why I am optimistic, in fact, that these processes continue today and can continue to guide decision making as we confront issues like sea level rise. This was, what the beach should have looked like around, this is images from around 1915. If we had followed the original plan of Columbus Brothers, this guy broke the rules. This is a hotelier named Brown who decided to build the first hotel. My firm later had the honor of working on that project. We have a succession of styles and architectural types that follow that are actually very tightly connected with each other and show a lot of continuity. But I consider these all layers of the city's development, including, I would say, the layers continued after our layer history-keeping efforts sort of ended, like the 1970s. That layer of elderly residents living in the building, which were really at the heart of Governor Mayor Kappenman's own sort of efforts to save the district for these people. The 80s, the 90s, the 2000s, they've all sort of brought us something interesting because we're not just talking about saving buildings, but we're talking about saving a district, right? Saving the character of the district. So how does the whole thing work together? There are a lot of things that we maybe take for granted in the district that may not be, in fact, described in district designations or in, if you were to do a historic resources report of a building, but perhaps the spaces in between, the front yard, for instance. This tradition of sort of extrapolating off the suburban pattern of front yards that are a legacy of that house, the original house planning of Miami Beach, but into small patios for the residents of the apartment buildings that came to be built on those lots, or these interstitial spaces that run between buildings, which are quite, I think this is a very Miami Beach scene, and then even some of the features that make up those spaces, like the little stoops and planters. So we really have to think about this. So we began our project on February 28th. That was the date of our kickoff site walk. We did that with Debbie Take, with Tom Mooney, and with the whole team that we had assembled. And we went through both districts, and it was a kind of, we tried to organize our tour in a way that we hit all the different conditions, the avenue, the street, the alley, that we hit, for instance, in Flamingo Park, the area where the houses are, and the area along Alton Road where those houses all have been converted to commercial uses. Up in the Collins Waterfront District, we also weaved around to try to hit all the various conditions, tall buildings, lower buildings, older buildings, newer buildings. And I think we hit a number of really interesting bases. We also heard from the city about what was happening in terms of planning and in terms of infrastructure, and especially in terms of the redevelopment of 11th Street. And we prepared for that these kind of little case studies of buildings that we would find along the way for the purpose of the team, so that we could say, well, this is an example of a two-story, 1930s Mediterranean revival. We didn't really list the building type, but we talked about whether there was a crawl space underneath, what the structural system was, and whether the building was contributing or not. This was just as a sort of a framework for us to discuss these buildings as we were walking around, and to discuss the problems that those buildings demonstrated as patterns. These are images from our tour. All right, so our approach. We began with some best practices research, and by looking back through the National Register and local designation reports. Right now, we've been looking at the current districts and trying to apply a typological approach, for one thing, try to understand the typologies better, and not just the typologies the way that I had investigated them previously through like a historical and planning prism, but through the prism of how it will affect their resiliency. How can we begin to categorize buildings according to certain approaches, and the approaches that we may take with those buildings. And we're not just looking at the buildings, but we're looking at landscapes as well, and roads, public spaces. We're using GIS and sort of combining databases from various sources to make maps. And so I'll show you an example of some of the maps that we're making. But and in fact, we're not really using GIS. We're kind of hacking that, and we're using Grasshopper off a 3D model to kind of simulate the process. But we're getting information that I think is demonstrating certain characteristics about how the beach works, how it's put together. We're starting to look at what extreme water looks like. And one of the things that our civil engineers are doing is they're trying to remodel rain events, storm events, and king tide events. And think about how much water we can therefore expect on a typical building lot in each one of those events, because that will help us think about how much water we need to deal with, how much water we need to either store, drain, or percolate into the substrate. So this is quite interesting. We're looking at water infiltration versus water storage, and we're trying to model the impacts of water events and resilience. One of the, let's see if I can make this work here. We just started by looking chronologically at the development of the district year by year to just kind of understand the heritage of the buildings. This was easy because this information was readily available. Interestingly, although in 1 year the amount of building, more than 7% of the district was built, in almost every other year, less than 1% of the district was built. So the district is not, I think sometimes we tend to think that the district was the result of very condensed periods of development, and that is true. There are these very condensed periods of development, but I think the overall continuity of the district over 100 years is also super interesting. So this is an example of some initial building typology studies. So this is, for instance, a typical building of the 1920s, or a building type of the 1920s, although we can see it built in the 1930s and then afterward 1940s. It has an interior corridor, it has a masonry shell, it has wood frame construction, it has a crawl space underneath. Generally, it doesn't have a concrete frame. One of the things we're doing here is looking at the various form types that that building type generated, and that we find in our districts. We're excluding the ones that are not in our areas. If we put these all together, we get a group. We're trying to be minimalist here. I think we have 9 overall types, and we can see if we explore them on a form by type matrix, what we have in our districts. Another thing that we're looking at in this study is, and this came out of a study done by Yusuf Hashem and Miller Legg, documenting building elevations, FFE, floor elevation, lowest adjacent grade, foundation type, structural frame, ground floor structure, structural condition of the building, and what Yusuf developed as a raisability index. So he's basically categorized buildings by how raisable they are. And if we start to map these, we can begin to see that, for instance, this is just our district, our area of study in Flamingo Park. Most buildings sit on shallow footings. Very few buildings sit on pilings. Most buildings are masonry shell with wood framing, but some do have concrete frame. And when we put it together in Yusuf's recipe for raisability, we see that, in fact, most of the district is considered raisable. We're also developing wall sections through the buildings to be able to understand better how changes like raising the building or adapting the building will play out constructively in terms of construction. And then some other concerns that are at work here. I think we need to think about how any guidelines or any plan for the district are implemented or sequenced. I think that can be very important. Susie Torienti has kind of emphasized sometimes the things that we can do now. I think the approaches that we can take incrementally to begin the process, and I think that's really important. And perhaps this is a marathon, but there are certain steps that we could begin to do now. So one of the things we're looking at is short, medium, and long-term effects. So we're working across that spectrum. We're also thinking about public versus private. So the city is raising roads, but the issue of adapting buildings is going to fall to the owners of those buildings. And so how will that work? And how do those two efforts combine or connect with each other? Accessibility is an issue. We are required, it's a civil right to provide accessibility to buildings. So how do we guarantee accessibility with raising roads, raising buildings, a combination of those, which is not certain yet which ones are going to happen first. These are really interesting issues. And then the last two that I would mention, future-proofing and social equity. Future-proofing is the idea that, well, while we're doing work, while we're going through the process of adaptation and thinking about how does that cost play out in the future life of the district. The district is a place of mixed income, from my knowledge, having raised buildings, it can be quite expensive. There was a recent study done by Jesse Keenan and others that basically looked at the effect of sea level rise, resiliency on pricing of land, and basically showing that land values were rising higher in areas of the city that were at higher elevation, that had less vulnerability. But let's turn it around and say, Miami Beach has made the decision to adapt, to move forward, and it will. And there will be a cost, and probably that will mean that it will become more expensive to live here. And so how do we deal with that? Not that our study is going to have the answer to all those things, but we're thinking about it. I think it needs to be in the back of our mind. And just a few things that are going through our mind as we're working on this project. We know that resiliency is more than just a response to water and wind. There are economic, cultural, and social impacts and others that we need to be thinking about. We need to leverage the opportunity of dealing with this issue to create opportunities as well. It's not just purely a reactive exercise. And the story of the city's evolving resilience should be part of the story of Miami Beach, a legible layer. Again, I like to think of the city in all of these layers. I think this is just the latest layer, and a very interesting one that will, that I think in 30 years we'll be protecting. Perhaps, who knows. And then finally, because I don't have anything solid to show you in terms of strategy, I brought the work of one of my students because I worked with Isaac Stein, who was an undergraduate doing a thesis in Miami Beach, which was about 5 or 6 years ago. And he's been working since then at West 8 in the Netherlands. And he was looking at, strangely enough, the exact same area we're looking at right now. He's looking at the west end, mainly, of the Flamingo Park District, although he had ideas for the whole area as well. And one of the things that he was proposing is a series of canals that would run up the main avenues and serve as a kind of a water storage technique. And that those would feed into Flamingo Park. I mean, actually, I think he may have been the first to identify Flamingo Park as a big resource in terms of not just a great public park, but a place where water could potentially, from the whole Flamingo Park district, be channeled. It could be one of these interesting new genre of parks that we see, for instance, in the Netherlands, where they can be wet and they can be dry. And when there's a flooding event, they're temporarily wet, and that's designed into the park itself. And he had the idea of breaking down. And this is, I'm just showing this. It's interesting to look at it in the context of the project of breaking down the seawalls on the west side of the city and bringing back the mangrove buffer that had been present at the in Miami Beach originally, and but of course not losing things, the public accessibility that is such an important part of what makes district work, city work. Raising the roads, but raising them actually on columns so that the water can flow underneath. The strategy, not unlike what's happening in some places in the Everglades, and creating this opportunity to walk through the districts in a way with contact with water, which I think is quite provocative. This is a section through a canal, through the center of one of Miami Beach's avenues, so perhaps a little Dutch influence. But I propose all this, I throw all this out in the interest of also stimulating some discussion and getting feedback. I would say that, among all the possibilities that are often thrown out for an area challenged by sea level rise, retreat is often mentioned. And I don't think retreat is an option for Miami Beach. It's too valuable. And I don't mean real estate value. I mean cultural value, urban value, the value of a great city. So I find this to be a really important moment. I'm really grateful to be working on this important project, and I'll conclude there. Thank you. And I'll take any questions that you have.
Earlier, Nancy referred to Palm Beach and the efforts of some residents to unlisted. Many of the residents, as they have talked about resiliency issues being one of their reasons for wanting to do this. Seemingly unaware of that historic preservation is not their problem, that resiliency and sustainability is their problem. I think it would be very valuable if this study could be expanded to include the Palm Beach neighborhood. And begin to form a basis for discussions about the future of the neighborhood and how to address its problems rather than its emotional concerns.
I mean, I think you want to add something, Nancy?
Yes, when I talked about it, I didn't say where the neighborhood was, but I also didn't say it's really a small group, a local group. There are a lot of other people there, and we are going to try to put them together to get them, and of course we may be calling them.
Oh, sure. I mean, I think this comes out of that logic that historic preservation and resiliency are at odds with each other and are irreconcilable, and that you have to make a decision between them. But I don't think that's where our study is going. Certainly, we know that our understanding of the preservation districts may evolve in some ways to deal with resiliency, but I believe that historic preservation is still the prism through which we are investigating this thing. I think historic preservation also brings a lot of assets to the table when it comes to resilience. I mean, at the same time, people may argue that you have to make a choice between them. Many people have individually designated their houses so that they can take advantage of certain waivers that are available for historic properties that are not available for new properties. So, I think it's a complex story, but I really think for the areas that we've been looking at, I haven't looked at Elm Grove in this context, preservation is absolutely the window through which we're exploring this. I probably could
I have a question. In doing this study, I'm curious to see if you are finding patterns as to how devising guidelines for a specific typology would relate. Perhaps it's the same historic district, but the street is at a different elevation, and how those patterns can actually be achieved. I don't know if you-
Are you saying whether certain building types respond better to street raising than others?
Not specifically because the resiliency need would be street raising, but perhaps in another exposed area would be wind, and then how those patterns can actually be developed.
Well, the typologies have very different performance in many ways. There's different raisability, although we saw that, according to one way of looking at it, most of the buildings can be raised. We know, for instance, that buildings that are lifted off the ground, that are already on a crawl space or something, are more easily raisable. Obviously, taller buildings have larger wind impacts, but taller buildings in Miami Beach tend to have concrete frames, whereas lower ones are unreinforced easily, quite often. Some buildings have flat roofs, others have sloped roofs that have different performance in high wind. And some buildings, are renovated and have impact windows, and some buildings still have their original. So there's a wide variety of variables out there. But I think the typology, we wouldn't have done the typology study if we didn't think that each typology really had to be looked at separately in terms of its how those effects work. I think we also, I know as an architect working on these buildings that some buildings are easier to add to or to make changes to than other buildings. Raising buildings, certain building types, raising buildings is much more complicated than others because of the building code implications of those raises. So I don't know if I'm answering your question. It is very typological. It is very typological.
Is part of your study aimed at addressing those building code issues?
I think our study is aimed, yes, I think some building code issues should be questioned or looked at. I think we're looking more at the zoning code than the building code because I think that's more doable. The issue with the building code is very much already about resilience. Building code requires structures to be at BFE +1. There's issues wet and dry floodproofing, upgrading the building for impact wind. That's already in the building code. So the building code is actually well constructed to deal with many of these issues. One of the issues I think I have with the building code is that, for instance, an issue of raising the building, according to the current building code, places you in a category of construction that requires bringing the whole building up to code. So if I want to raise my building 24 inches and I find a building mover who can do that effectively, I'm in a category 3 renovation where I have to, completely reinforce the structure for all wind impacts. I have to put in impact windows. I have to put in new mechanical systems, new plumbing systems, new electrical systems. So I think the opportunity for inexpensive, expedited raising of buildings isn't likely to happen under the current building code. Now, the building official has the ability to override those building code impacts, but probably wouldn't under the way things work today. It isn't typical for the building official to override the code. So that's where I think that is an issue. In terms of zoning, there's lots of issues, I'm sure, that have to do with, that will come out of the guidelines that may affect zoning. But I'm not sure what they all are. Yes?
How can you raise a building that's 10, 20, 30 stories high?
We haven't looked at raising buildings that are that big, and I think it's unlikely that a building that is that big would be raised. I think the issue, most of the buildings that are that large have actually parking on the ground floor. They're raised already to some degree. One could look at other strategies like abandoning a level, reconfiguring the level above as an entrance to the building.
When our garage is quarterback on the back.
Your garage?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then, I mean, it's gonna happen what happened in New York. The right away, but the basement and the first 2 stories were flooded.
Yeah, so we've been looking at building effects, not as much at garages and parking. I don't, that's another question in terms of parking garages. But you're right, there are parking, I don't know where you live, but there are parking garages that are built right at water level. And there's parking that's built below water level. Yeah, one last question. Yes. Hey.
My question is more along the education of the design students in the area. We've got some great design schools here. Are they doing like any charades or competitions of doing like even conceptual ideas of construction processes and building types? You kind of touched on it with the master plan of one of your students, but I was just wondering if they have anything going like that. And then with our historic architecture being such a wide and varied group of styles, are there any of the schools that have the students come out and study existing buildings and how they're constructed and the architectural details and kind of lines in that?
The schools are very involved in what's happening in these districts. And I know John is here is probably going to talk more about FIU. I mean, we have at the University of Miami the Center for Urban and Community Design, which has gotten a number of projects in the district and around the district, both in Miami and Miami Beach, that deal with this question of sea level rise. We do something every year called U-Serve, which is basically where all the students work on a project in the city, and we just actually, by chance, the students did this, or maybe it wasn't by chance, maybe you guys have discussed it, but the students actually did a new survey of this district, a kind of windshield survey, using an app that we developed to kind of take a new look at how things were working in the district. Many studios within at the University of Miami, many studios are devoted to this topic, to resiliency. I think we're about to do another one in the spring. We had one last year, so there's a lot of stuff going on.
Just get presented to the public so the public can understand that there's something being generated towards the future.
That's a great question. Probably not enough. Thank you for the opportunity to show things, because I think this is one venue where we can actually talk about what students and what the university are doing. But it's true that there probably needs to be a larger communication effort about all the things that are happening. By the way, in terms of students, I'm embarrassed to admit, because I think our local schools should be in the leadership of all this, but there's schools from all over the world that are here working. There's been a Harvard study, a University of Pennsylvania study. I've been working with a group from Leipzig who are here, also with a group of students looking at resiliency and preservation. So there's a lot underway. Yeah. So that's it. Thank you very much.